Hello and welcome back to a Clear and Obvious podcast. As always, I'm Archie Corbett and I'm joined by the wonderful Sam Cole. Sam, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, mate. How are you?
Not too bad. But we are delighted to be joined by leading football lawyer and author of the critically acclaimed Done Deal, Daniel Geey. Daniel, how are you?
Yeah, all good. Thanks to all of you. Working from home today, been in the office a little bit this week. Plenty of interesting stuff going on. So yeah, no, thanks for having me on, guys.
Brilliant.
To get started, we're going to talk about how you started getting into football law. So, could you first of all describe your job for someone that might not know exactly what it is you do?
Well, there's two ways to describe my job. The quite cool way of describing my job is saying I work with football clubs, football agents, and players. And the more geeky technical way is saying I advise on contracts, disputes, regulations, and intellectual property. So whichever way you want to take it, you can use that as an example.
Yeah, awesome. How do you get into football law, and what motivated you to become a football lawyer?
Yeah, again, I think like you guys, I'm sure you're all football fans, and I grew up as a massively obsessive Liverpool fan. Continue to be a Liverpool fan, not quite massively as obsessive anymore. But you know, I read everything I could do about the industry. You know, I took that interest into my law undergraduate degree. I read lots of cases, tried to work out which areas of law would be interesting for me to go into in the sports world. But to be fair, for the best part of 10, 12, 13 years, I was doing absolutely lots of different industry work, from agriculture to pharmaceuticals to automobile to aviation to financial services to telco work, whilst just building my sort of expertise and knowledge in sports and football more generally. So really, it's only in the last 7 or 8 years I'd probably say that I've spent the majority and now all of my time doing sports and football. So it's been quite an evolution, is the truth. So
let's go straight into it, because one of the areas that you specialise in is obviously contract negotiations and sort of regulating those. What's the most common thing that holds up sort of a contract agreement sort of going through?
There's no end to problems, or can be problems, is true. A lot of the time, I would probably say that that's an easier question for the agent to answer, because what happens when I usually tend to get involved in transfers and renegotiations is, what tends to have happened is the commercial negotiation is probably already finalized. So whilst the commercial heads of agreements have probably been agreed between agent, club, player, etc., it's only at that stage that I will come in to go through the various elements of the deal, to go through particular parts generally, and then do some advice on particular laws, particular regulations, to see how the agents and everything else stuff works. So that's the general approach that I'll tend to take. And so there's always tons of stuff that can hold up deals. But ultimately, you know, when I get involved, it will be because the deal is probably about 90% of the way there. Now, what can sometimes happen is issues can arise in the meantime where players don't want to leave, particular monies and bonuses aren't necessarily going to be paid. There might be issues over what the agent's fee or how it's going to be paid and structured over a particular period of time. There may be things to do with image rights and boot deals which need to be arranged, or previous commercial deals which need to be ironed out. So there's always tons of things that can go wrong, but usually when I tend to get involved in deals, things commercially are probably about 80 to 90% of the way through.
Yeah, and you sort of talk about the kind of the specifics of the agreements there. What kind of specific incentives are there that both the player and an agent are looking for in a deal specifically?
Well, yeah, it's a good one as well. I guess from a player perspective, there could be lots of things. It can be the sporting journey or project. It can be maximizing, you know, his earning potential or her earning potential over a particular period of time. It can be because they want particular, exposure to a certain market. It might be that they want playing time because they want to break into a national team, for example. It might be because they really like the coach. It might be because, like Liverpool, for example, they're champions and want to be playing with other elite players. It might be that other players want more of a challenge or other things. So the player side can be, absolutely multifaceted. On the agent side, ultimately, the agent is at all times acting in the best interests of the player. The agent's idea effectively is to ensure that really they can maximize probably the term of the deal, i.e. the length of the contract, because obviously the longer the deal, the greater financial security the player will ultimately have, mixed with, is it the right project? Is it the right manager? Is it the right club? What is the playing style like? What is the leadership style like? What type of dressing room are they going into, etc. So it's those types of variables probably too, I'd have thought.
Yeah, and you sort of speak about agents there. We'll go on to that a little bit later because I've got quite a few interesting sort of questions on that side of things that you deal with. Just a bit more of a fun one here. So what's the strangest clause that you can remember seeing in a player's contract at any particular point?
Well, as you guys will probably know, I've always got to be a little bit careful about breaching confidentiality, because otherwise I'll probably get sacked and no one would ever want to employ me again. But in Done Deal, there's loads of quite cool examples of reports that were in playing contracts. One of the best that I saw and I still like to this date was Stefan Schwarz's contract, which included a clause which effectively said that he wasn't allowed to go into space. And apparently that was because an eagle-eyed club secretary previously had read that one day he would like to go into space. So they tried to future-proof his employment contract to ensure that at least he didn't go into space during the time that he was a Sunderland player. And there was another great clause, but with a player called Neil Ruddock that might be before your guys' time, but he
Razor
was
Ruddock, yeah.
Razor Ruddock indeed. So he, when he was playing for Crystal Palace towards the end of his career, I think it's probably fair to say at different times of his career, he probably went through different levels of weight gain and loss. Played very well, had a very good left foot, played well for Liverpool, scored some important goals. But apparently they included a weight clause in his deal, which effectively stated that if he went above a certain weight, that part of his wages would potentially be deducted. Now, it was quite ironic in the end that apparently he couldn't end up making his debut because they couldn't find a pair of shorts big enough for him to actually wear. So, I think, I don't know whether that's an urban myth or not, but I certainly like the story, if nothing else.
Brilliant.
Moving on to transfer fees. Are there any parts of transfer deals that we as fans don't really get to see?
Well, almost all of it is the truth. Because, if you can imagine sometimes that like a transfer is a bit like an iceberg, that you see the end bit and the glory bit, which is this is the numbers, these are the wages, this is the thing, why does it have to take too long for the deal to happen, etc. But usually the bit under the sea level is all of the stuff that's happened before the announcement is made, which is sometimes the 2 or 3 years beforehand, where the agent's building the relationship with the right chief executive and the scouts and the technical directors, and understanding that maybe they'll need a right back in 12 months or maybe it's 18 months, and then your client might be available but the current club wants to keep him for another particular period of time, etc., and then the opportunity potentially arises, but there's a gap between the transfer fee evaluation and how much they want to pay by way of wages. And then, another 6 months passes, and then there's more of a negotiation with the consent of everybody, and things start moving. So the truth is, usually what goes on before the transfer announcement is probably about 99.9% of the hard work. And although fans seem like, or suggest sometimes that it's almost like, why can't the deal be done and why does it take so long? When you're talking about potentially 50 to 100 million pounds worth of liability in terms of transfer fees, agents fees, wages, image rights deals, etc., it can sometimes take some careful negotiation.
Yeah. Who from a club is directly involved in a decision to make a transfer? For instance, are there certain clubs, without asking you to name any names, where you've seen a first team manager has very little or no influence in the transfer, and the majority of the decisions are made from higher up in the club?
I think the truth is, from my side, is I don't tend to see too much of the sporting decision making occurring. So, I will sometimes be liaising with the technical directors, the chief executives, the chairman, sporting directors, who are effectively conducting the negotiation that I'm maybe assisting the agent with in different ways. Now, will it be the manager that's doing the negotiation? Almost certainly not. Nowadays, especially for the elite clubs, further down the pyramid, that's probably certainly the case. But in the sort of bigger deals that I tend to get involved in now, there's in-house legal counsel, there's technical directors, and there's football directors, or whoever else it might be with those particular responsibilities. So I think it's rare at the elite level. It might well be that the talent identification job is done between scouting, technical director, and manager, etc. But in terms of then the negotiation that occurs, it's usually with the technical teams as a result.
How frustrating is it for you when a deal falls apart at the last minute? And does it impact your relationship with a club or player in any way?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I mean, I think ultimately, I just want to make sure that the deal doesn't fall apart because of anything that I've done. And a lot of the time, you've got to be careful of the sensitivities of the relationship between the player and the agent, the agent and the club, and the player and the club. So there's always different things to look at. Ultimately, when you're dealing with quite a lot of difficult legal concepts, you've got to be able to, as a lawyer, be a decent communicator and a good enough communicator to explain the consequences of certain clauses and particular things that might crop up. So, I haven't, thank goodness, had too many deals fall over the line because of things that have happened because of me. Sometimes it can be that the commercial deal doesn't stack up. It could sometimes also be that the buying club's negotiating with a couple of teams at the same time. And that player might just be one option that then falls away if a certain possibility doesn't occur. So, ultimately, I know that I've got to look after the ultimate interest, which tends to be my relationship between the agent and the player, and making sure that usually is as strong as it can be.
I'm also just sort of quite interested at what point, because you sort of say it's near the end, but is there sort of a specific point at which you're called in to deal with a player or an agent or a transfer that's happening? What sort of point do you then come into?
It depends on the client and the agent sometimes. My most difficult one is when the agent will phone me and say, "Oh, Dan, we're concluding a deal this afternoon at 5 o'clock and it's 3 o'clock." And then they'll just say, have a quick look over the docs. But then, that thank goodness doesn't happen too regularly. And what I'll tend to try and do is go on the journey with the agent and the player of, this might be happening this week. Okay, have we got this through? What's happening? Have the terms been agreed? What's the general approach been? How have we done things previously, et cetera, et cetera. So, on the whole, I prefer as much preparation, as much lead-in time as possible. But, sometimes when either the agent wants to get things done quickly, or it's actually been quite opportunistic, and then a deal comes out of nowhere, then you've sometimes just as a lawyer got to be reactive enough then to jump on and then do as good a job as you can.
And you sort of speak about agents there. They're possibly some of the most divisive figures in football. So there's sort of an increasing stereotype around player agents, and I'd say sort of a negative rhetoric with them in their role. And what can a good agent truly offer a player that you've seen in your experience?
Well, part of one of the chapters of my book in Done Deal is all about just trying to level out the negative publicity that can sometimes be attracted to agents, because a lot of the time there are a number of very, very good, professional, strategic, brilliantly networked, excellent communicators, very good negotiators that have brilliant relationships with clubs, with other agents, and with their players to be able to get things done. It's not an easy process to get any type of transfer done at the best of times, never mind in pretty pressurized situations involving high profile individuals, where lots of information could get easily leaked out, and lots of name games and name calling can be done if things don't work out well. So, ultimately, I think a lot of the time what players are keen on ensuring, and again, players come with lots of different personality types as well, is generally is their agent getting things done when they need things done. Is a move happening? Is it not? How much, am I going to get paid for the relatively short career that I have that's going to last myself and my family for the best part of 50 years after retirement, possibly? How can he or she negotiate the best deal for me? Which type of club is going to suit my attributes the most? Does my agent have the power and network to be able to phone up any chief executive or scouting director or technical director in the country and in Europe to be able to find out the position of, where the club is and whether that player would potentially fit into that particular situation. So it's all of those things. It's competency, it's network, it's the ability to find solutions in difficult situations. It's sometimes the ability to keep your head in a very pressurized moment as well. And it's a track record of getting things done, I think.
Yeah, he's sort of spoken about their kind of what agents can offer their players, so a good agent, for instance. But why do you think this rhetoric exists around agents and super agents, maybe specifically, being perhaps detrimental to a player's development, for instance?
Well, again, I think it's sometimes the narrative in your question, which is an interesting one itself, because, I'm not necessarily convinced that lots of agents have their own aims and objectives in the forefront to the detriment of the player. Usually when a deal happens, the player benefits through moving to a better club, moving hopefully with a greater sense of security. And, ultimately what I think the fans don't understand or have less understanding of is, an agent doesn't necessarily get paid 2 million up front and then wait another year and then try and move the player on somewhere else and then get another 2 million up front. Usually the way agents are paid is they're paid over the length of the player's contract. So in a way, whether the player stays, the agent earns, and whether the player leaves, the agent, whether the player leaves as well, the agent will still earn on a new deal. So it's not like there's suddenly this whole incentive for the agent to move the player on inside a relatively short period of time. That's not usually the market norm.
And this spawned more of a specific one because it's a question I've sort of had on my mind for a little while, and I was just struggling to get my head around it. It's the idea of an appearance fee that's put into contracts quite regularly, because you sort of see how outside the game people might think that's a little bit strange because they're getting paid by their base contracts to actually provide a service for the club, which is playing. Why? What benefit does an appearance fee actually have? Because that's what they're getting paid to do. Could you sort of shed a bit of light on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's more to do with the performance element and the variable amounts of players' contracts these days, which are becoming a greater proportion of the overall remuneration. So, in the past, it might have been that players earn quite a high set amount without too much variable pay, and then there might be, additional bonus amounts for wins or goals scored or assists or clean sheets, for example. Now, there's a growing number of elite clubs, especially, and a number of other clubs throughout the football pyramid that are endeavouring to try and provide a lower basic number, which effectively guarantees, a solid foundation, but incentivizes the players to play and they contribute and win and or draw, which shows, progression. So you mix in a lower base with a bigger upside, a variable upside, if the player contributes. That is seen as more of a supposedly motivating, performance enhancing way of ensuring, if the player is so inclined, continual motivation over a long period of time. Obviously, there'll always be the ambition of the player, regardless of the money, to play well for his own and for the team's collective benefits. But that's where a lot of clubs are now seeing those incentives aligned.
Now, just quickly onto your book. Done Deal, forward by Gianluca Vialli. Just explain what the motivation was behind releasing a book about your experiences in the business.
Yeah, great one. I mean, I think ultimately what I considered from a long time ago was that I'd written quite a lot of blogs on the football industry generally, and one of my friends had said, you should just put them all in a big compendium. Fast forward a few years and I put a book proposal together and managed to get a deal with Bloomsbury. But the idea generally was to almost look back at my younger self when I had a little bit more hair and less grey hair at that as well, which was just thinking about the book that would have been of real value to me just starting out as a novice in the industry, understanding how lots of the machinations of the football industry and the football ecosystem work, if it's player contracts or transfers or agents or broadcasting rights or third-party ownership or FFP or disciplinary or social media, managers' contracts, etc. So, ideally what I tried to think back on was all of the questions that people had asked me about my blogs, mixed in with some of the blogs that I'd written and updated, mixed in with, the common misconceptions that people actually think about the sports, in particular the football industry. And, I've been lucky enough that, thank goodness, on the whole, apart from a couple of 1-star reviews on Amazon, everyone's been generally pretty positive about it, which is really nice. It's just opened really interesting doors to have conversations like with you guys, for example, that otherwise might not have been able to have. And, hopefully in time, there might be a second edition, an updated edition, maybe in a couple of years' time if I have the time.
Yeah, because I was going to say, because you've got to have so many stories, having worked in the industry. How tricky was it to sort of collate them all into one book? It must have been, to sort of specify exactly what you want to get out of it and all that sort of thing. How tricky was that?
Well, in the end, what I just tried to do was only make reference to stuff that was reported in the mainstream press, really. So there would have been, I would never be able to disclose stories of deals that I was involved in and the clients that I was working with generally. But, I think you tend to get an idea about the way that the industry works, about the examples that then you can use, about thinking behind the headlines rather than just what the headlines say, etc. So, yeah, it was just to try and demystify the way things go a little bit and just really open up people's ideas as to how the industry works. And then, in a great way, get asked lots of questions about the way that I've written things, about particular details, about particular nuances. And then you go on to all types of cool tangents. Like, a lot of people don't realize, without going back to the agents side of things, that, players don't pay their agents, or that, image rights takes up a certain proportion of a player's potential remuneration, or that, when you see a transfer fee quoted, that usually that transfer fee will never be the full amount ever paid. Or, when you're talking about the transfer fee, then usually the more significant amount of money to be as a liability is going to be, the player's wages rather than the fee potentially. So, all of those things in the mix, just to, gradually and hopefully interestingly educate, fans that will be looking at the back pages if people are reading newspapers anymore. As well as, just people that want to know a little bit more to educate themselves on the space.
Yeah, because you sort of talk about the education side of it there, and it's slightly away from the book. You're quite prominent on TikTok. You've got a podcast. You're quite prominent on YouTube as well. Is that just sort of adds to the further education of fans and try shed your insight in sort of a variety of platforms?
So yeah, for your listeners and watchers, you'll be pleased to know that when you mention TikTok, I'm not dancing or singing on TikTok. I'm just retelling some talks and all different bits that I've given over the years. But yeah, ideally, it's just trying to reach lots of different audiences through the media of digital, which is, especially at this time as well, where, people aren't being able to meet as regularly or otherwise, or at all, having that amplification to be able to educate, to be able to help, to be able to move people along their sort of education and career journey. I've always really enjoyed speaking about, really. I always worried 5 years ago that what will be the next thing after Twitter, after having a few Twitter followers. And, there will always be another platform that you'll be able to hopefully engage people on. My idea is just to try and keep evolving a little bit so that I stay semi-relevant, that the things that I say will be of use.
Finally, a question we like to ask all our guests is, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Oof, you got deep and meaningful on me in the last bit. The truth is, I would quite like to be doing the same type of thing. Maybe if that's a bit trite, is that, I do really enjoy working in the football industry. I love sharing my knowledge to people. So maybe a bit more lecturing or motivational speaking, or, maybe writing, a second edition of Done Deal. I'm also in the midst of trying to write a book at the moment on a career path into sports, because a lot of people on a daily basis are asking me how to get into the entertainment world, how to get into the football world, how to get into the sports world. So I'm just trying to think about, a bit of a self-development book on some of the lessons that I've learned along my journey. So I think that's one of the things I'd like, hopefully I'm going to be able to concentrate on doing a little bit as well. But, first and foremost, it's, my day-to-day job. I'd like to say it's 9 to 5, but it's probably about 8 till 10. So, and then all the other cool things that I really enjoyed doing, like the podcast, as you mentioned, like all of the digital ways to amplify the messages that I'm talking about. I've got a charity clothes brand that I really enjoy publicizing and trying to provide some money to charity. I sit on a couple of sports charity boards as well. One is Football Aid, which I really enjoy publicizing that, the great charity there, the work that they do there. So as you can probably see, it's quite a lot of variety, and that's what keeps me busy and interested.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you've got so many stories, and we'd love to talk to you for hours. But we're going to wrap it up here. So thank you very much for joining us. All the best with everything you're doing. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.